Hey guys, it's Alex, and I'm here with a book review that's been a while coming, and I think is going to be the last of my super hyped book reviews for at least a while. I read this book at the beginning of October, and I had a very unpopular opinion about it, and that book is The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This book is about a journalist named Monique who's interviewing an aging movie star who was very popular in the 50s and 60s and has been retired from the public spotlight for a few decades now. Evelyn Hugo was a bombshell. She was super well known worldwide, one of the most famous movie stars of her time. Fictional, of course, she wasn't a real person. She was quite similar to Marilyn Monroe, I believe, in her typical aesthetic and how she sold herself to audiences. And Evelyn is telling her story of her 7 husbands and her life to Monique in order to publish a biography of her life. This book has been getting so much incredible hype on BookTube, and honestly, before I started it, I hadn't heard a single negative thing about it, or even a mediocre thing about it. I think everyone I'd seen had given it either 5 or 4 stars and absolutely loved it. And I did enjoy this book. I had certain issues with it, but overall I gave it 3 stars, which is not a negative review. 3 stars is a positive rating for me, but so many people have rated it 5 stars and it's become one of their favorites that I feel like there was a lot of curiosity as to what I didn't like about it as much. But as with most of my reviews, I'm going to start with the positive things and then get into what I had issues with towards the end. To start the things I really liked, I really enjoyed Evelyn's story throughout the book, throughout her life. I loved learning about Hollywood in the 50s through the 80s, I believe, is pretty much when she left Hollywood, and then just her life through the 90s and 2000s. It was so interesting to me. I was incredibly invested. It genuinely really sucked me in. I don't know much about Hollywood, and I don't read that many stories set around Hollywood, but this is the kind of Hollywood story I enjoy, where it's very much behind the scenes and how things work, and just all these normal people who just happen to be movie stars, because that's how it works. They're all normal people too. And this was such an interesting perspective. There were so many interesting characters in this as well. Not all very likable characters, but very interesting and well-rounded characters. I was always curious to know what was happening to them and what they were like and what was going on in their lives even after they left the story, and sometimes they would come back, and I really loved the way it was woven together. I thought it was really well done in that regard. Now getting more into my negative thoughts on this book and what I had more of an issue with. I have 2 main issues and then a couple more that I'm going to weave in at the end, as I usually do in my reviews. The first issue I had with this book was Monique. Monique was a fine character. I didn't have an issue with her as a character. I had an issue with her role within the story. I didn't care. That sums it up completely. I just didn't care about Monique. I didn't care about her story. I did not care in the slightest. Every time she had a section in the book, it felt so jarring. It was an interruption from the story that I cared about, that I was invested in and enjoying, and then we would come back to Monique, and I just had no interest in Monique. I understand that she became important at the end, but that wasn't enough for me. I felt like I was always suffering through her sections, and I just wanted to skip forward and get back to Evelyn Hugo, because I cared about Evelyn Hugo and I cared about her story, but I didn't care about Monique's story. For me, this would have worked so much better if it had just been Evelyn Hugo's story, even if Monique had stayed as a side character, as someone who was introduced at the beginning but didn't come back in until the end. I didn't like that she kept being interjected into the story because it kept interrupting the flow for me, and I can't stress how little I cared about her at any point in the story. Even at the end, the amount that I was interested was very minimal. And just a smaller note on that did kind of bother me but wasn't as big of an issue. In my edition, there are no headings at any of the chapters. It doesn't say when Monique is going to have a chapter or when Evelyn is having a chapter. And especially in like the middle of the book and towards the end of the book, when Monique wasn't getting as many chapters, and it would take me a couple of sentences at the beginning of a chapter to realize that the point of view had shifted and the time had shifted, and now we were reading from Monique, and it just seemed like it would have been such an easy thing to just headline the chapters whenever the viewpoint switched. That really irritated me. It seemed like there was no reason to do that. My second major issue was the writing during Evelyn's chapters. Evelyn was telling her story to Monique, and that very much came through in the writing of the book. Whenever it was one of Evelyn's sections talking about her past life, her earlier husbands, it read very much like telling. And I feel this book is a prime example of telling versus showing and why telling doesn't work as much. Because for me, it was always very clear that I was being told a story secondhand, and because of that, it made it more difficult to experience it, to feel the story and feel connected to the characters. I was interested in the story, but I didn't feel like I was experiencing it the way I so often like to do in stories. It was really a detriment to my enjoyment of the story overall, because I know that Evelyn was telling it to me and I wasn't being able to experience it firsthand. And I'm aware that that was the point of the story, but just because it was done intentionally didn't make it work any better for me. The last few small issues I have with the story, I didn't think it was written particularly well, to be honest. It wasn't horribly written, but there were definitely a lot of instances where I felt like it could have been done better, or she felt more like a novice writer. Considering this is one of her later novels, I think she's written several novels before this, that was definitely kind of a turnoff for wanting to read any of her earlier works. Just for example, like whenever a new character was introduced, we would stop the story, stop the narrative, and have just a paragraph describing what they looked like, their fashion sense, and their general vibe as a person. And that felt really amateurish to me, and it felt like a lazy way to write. I just really didn't enjoy her writing style that much. Which is probably in part because I don't like first-person present tense. I never have. That's always something a story has to get over for me to enjoy it. It's my least favorite perspective and tense combination. I'd rather read anything else. But I do enjoy some novels that are written like that. This just didn't do it for me in that regard. At times in Monique's chapters, it felt like it was trying really hard to be like super quirky and like in your face about it, and I didn't enjoy that very much. I kind of had an issue with the way race was represented in this. Not horribly so. I don't want to make it sound like I thought this was poor representation when it came to race, because that's much, much stronger than what I actually feel. But while reading this, it was very early in the book. I think possibly even the first page, I was reading Monique's descriptions of being biracial, and I just got the vibe and started wondering, is this written by a white author? And I checked in the back, and it was. And it sort of felt like that throughout the book. I could tell that it was a white author writing about race. It was an outsider writing about race. And that was sort of a turnoff to me. It wasn't a huge deal because, like I said, I don't think it was necessarily poor racial representation, but it was something that I noticed, and I know I don't have a platform to speak on this here. I'm not trying to. I'm not going to go like greater in depth on that. It was just something that I noticed and wanted to point out. I think most of the people that I've seen talk about this book have been white, so I'd be curious about someone who is a person of color and what they think of the racial representation, because I don't think I've heard any commentary on that at all. But all that being said, it did make a lot of interesting social commentary when it came to sexuality and a woman's role in the world and how a woman is looked at. It dealt a lot with sexism and somewhat with racism, although not as much because Evelyn Hugo was very much white passing for a lot of her life. And I did enjoy reading it. I do want to stress that because I'm not giving this book a negative review. I enjoyed it and I would recommend it because I do understand why people love this book so much. I just had some issues with it that sort of overwhelmed the positives a little bit. But I am very glad I read it, and I did contemplate giving it 4 stars for a minute, but I really do think this book just didn't quite live up to that for me. It was a good read, it was an enjoyable read, but I don't think it's one that's going to stick with me, and that's sort of how I differentiate between 3 and 4 stars, is whether or not I think a book is going to stick with me, whether it's added something to my life, and as much as I did enjoy it, I don't think this book really did, and I don't think I'm better for having read it, if that makes sense. Let me know down below what you thought of this book, if you read it, if you disagree with me on any of these points, if there are things that I haven't heard brought up as much when people talk about this book, so I'd be really interested to see what other people who've read this book thought of what I had to say about it, since my opinion was slightly more negative, although I did still enjoy it quite a bit. So please do leave a comment. I would love to have conversations down in the comments below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys again soon. Bye!